U.S. President Donald Trump says a trade deal with India has been reached, with India agreeing to stop buying Russian oil.
Also, perhaps from Venezuela, too, which we know will now have a direct benefit on the United States and the American people. And in addition to that, Prime Minister Modi committed to $500 billion of investments into the United States, including for transportation, for energy, and for agricultural products as well. So,
by the President of the United States. And that's actually before we head. Our Prime Minister is going to be heading to India to actually work at a trade deal. And the question then is, are we looking at various blocks of trade agreements? Can we eventually say that maybe some of these will come together to find ourselves back in a more global arrangement? Probably.
Something big just shifted in the global trade chessboard, and Canada might be the one left staring at an empty square. Reports say the United States and India are moving toward, or have effectively reached, a trade arrangement that dramatically lowers tariffs on Indian exports into the U.S. We're talking about a drop from the kind of eye-watering.
India is quite hungry for more energy. I heard loud and clear they would take as much additional crude as we could supply.
Levels people were throwing around down into the teens, whether you've seen 15%, 18%, or other numbers mentioned. The direction is clear. India is getting a far smoother path into the American market for major categories like textiles, machinery, and a wide spread of industrial goods. And that alone would already matter. Because when a giant like India gets easier access to U.S. consumers, it changes where factories scale up, where investment flows, and which partners get priority. But the part that should really have Ottawa paying attention is the energy and geopolitical angle that's tied to this. According to statements attributed to the U.S. side, India agreed to reduce or halt purchases of Russian oil and instead increase purchases from the United States. In the same breath, there's also talk of India committing to buying an enormous amount of American product over time.
Negotiations are not going well.
You've got a bit of gamesmanship going on, playing off India and China, obviously two competing manufacturing, exporting powerhouses. So it'll be interesting to see what they say at the White House.
With figures floating around the $500 billion range across energy, technology, agriculture, coal, and more. Put simply, this isn't a little friendly deal. It reads like a long-term restructuring of trade relationships. Tariffs eased on one side, and on the other side, India locks in massive purchasing commitments that pull it deeper into American supply chains. If you're Canada, the timing is brutal because Canada's whole diversification story has been leaning on the idea that India is one of the next big doors.
And for additional natural gas, LPG, and conventional oil. There's also demand for critical minerals. There's also demand for potash. There's also an incredible opportunity to exchange capabilities with respect to renewables. What the Chinese and the Indian are doing in the way of baseload renewables is quite amazing. And we've got some real opportunities to take some of the technology.
A huge population, a fast-growing middle class, rising demand for food, fertilizer, energy, materials, and infrastructure. Canada has spent years saying, we can't be this dependent on the U.S. forever. We need other major partners. India was supposed to be a key part of that, and now imagine the Canadian Prime Minister landing in India to pitch Canadian oil, gas, LNG, potash, critical minerals, and agricultural products. Right after India has been publicly positioned as locking in a giant supply relationship with the U.S. that changes the entire tone of the conversation. It's not that India won't buy Canadian products at all. It's that Canada no longer shows up as the obvious next supplier. Canada shows up as the extra option, the maybe later. The country that needs to fight harder for a smaller slice of the pie. That's the strategic problem. Once supply chains get built, they get sticky. If India is being pulled toward long-term U.S. supply and logistics, American producers don't just sell goods, they build distribution systems. They negotiate regulatory pathways. They get inside the procurement pipelines. They become the default. And once a supplier becomes the default, displacing them is expensive and painful for buyers, even if another country offers comparable products. Now zoom out, because this gets worse for Canada when you factor in leverage. Canada's leverage in trade, negotiations with the United States, has always been limited, but there was at least a strategy to create options. Open up other markets, reduce dependence on U.S. demand, then show Washington that Canada has alternatives. The message becomes, we want a fair deal with you, but we're not trapped. That only works if the alternatives actually materialize, if India is increasingly aligned with U.S. supply chains, and if other major diversification paths are either difficult, slow, or politically complicated. Canada's "we have options" posture starts to collapse. And when your options collapse, your negotiating power collapses with it. On top of that, there's another layer. The U.S. is reporting strong manufacturing signals, with indicators being described as hitting multi-year highs. When manufacturing expands, it reinforces the American political argument that tariffs and hard-nosed trade deals are working. That matters because it hardens Washington's willingness to play rough. If they believe their approach is producing jobs and growth at home, they're less likely to compromise for Canada's comfort. Canada, meanwhile, is still dealing with internal friction that makes decisive economic strategy harder. Regional disputes, pipeline politics, energy policy fights, and provinces that feel like they're carrying weight without getting respect. When your house is divided, it's harder to act fast internationally, and the story doesn't stop at the U.S. and India. Venezuela keeps getting mentioned as a potential additional supplier in the energy conversation, which introduces another uncomfortable possibility. If Venezuelan oil ramps up with support, partnerships, or intermediary structures that favor American interests, it creates more competition for any producer trying to sell into big growth markets. And in energy, pricing matters. If a buyer can source cheaper barrels reliably, they will. Canada's oil sands are not the cheapest barrels on earth. They can be profitable, yes, but they're not the easy, low-cost option. That reality becomes a problem if competing supply gets easier to access and politically blessed through big agreements. So where does that leave Canada? Here's the hard question. What exactly is Canada offering that isn't already being covered by the new structure? India's demand is broad. It's not only oil. It's also LNG, LPG for household use, coal, in some cases, critical minerals, fertilizer like potash, agricultural imports, technology partnerships, and even renewables. Canada does have things India needs. The issue isn't Canada has nothing. The issue is that the U.S. is positioning itself to be the primary partner across a wide spread of categories at once. That squeezes Canada into a narrower lane. And it becomes even more politically sensitive when you compare what flows where, then the U.S. sells goods and locks in purchase commitments. Canada, in this narrative, ends up leaning heavily on immigration links with India, which creates a very different kind of relationship. Immigration is not automatically bad, but if people feel like Canada is becoming a place where money flows out via remittances, while major commercial opportunities flow elsewhere, that becomes a political flashpoint fast. People start asking why the country can welcome hundreds of thousands of newcomers, yet can't secure the kind of trade outcomes that build domestic industry wages and long-term tax base. That's the emotional core of why this story hits. It's not just policy. It's the feeling of being outplayed. And when countries get outplayed, it's rarely because they're unlucky. It's usually because they moved too slowly, assumed relationships would hold without being reinforced, or failed to build the infrastructure that turns natural resources into export power. Pipelines, ports, approvals, investment signals, consistent strategy. Without those, resources stay stuck behind domestic bottlenecks, while competitors ship freely. If you want a simple way to understand the danger, it's this. Canada has been trying to diversify away from U.S. dependence, but the U.S. is actively making itself even more central to the markets Canada wanted to enter. That's like trying to escape a room while someone keeps adding locks. And here's the long-term sting. Once India's procurement and supply chains are built around U.S. partners, it won't just be about price. It will be about relationships, standards, compatibility, contracts, and momentum. Even if Canadian companies show up with a strong offer, they're competing against an already installed system. That's why the phrase, "window slammed shut," keeps popping up in discussions like this. Not because trade is literally impossible, but because the easy moment, The moment where Canada could have entered early and scaled alongside India's growth curve may have been replaced by a tougher grind where Canada has to fight for scraps of demand that aren't already spoken for. So what happens next? Canada still has choices, but none of them are painless. It can try to carve out niche wins in India that aren't directly captured by U.S. supply chains, like specific critical minerals, specialized agri-products, or technology collaborations where Canada has unique strengths. It can accelerate domestic infrastructure so it can actually supply what it claims it can supply. It can also get serious about rebuilding, manufacturing, and value-added processing at home, because exporting raw inputs into a world of hardened trade blocks is increasingly a weak position. But the broader message of this US-India shift is loud. Countries are lining up to lock in with the superpower first and then dealing with everyone else second. If Canada wants to avoid becoming the secondary option, it has to move like a country that believes it matters. And if you're watching this from the outside thinking, why haven't we been hearing more about this? That's part of the point. These are the kinds of moves that don't feel dramatic day to day, but they shape the next decade. If you want to keep up with stories like this, hit subscribe right now. Seriously, these trade shifts don't just affect headlines, they affect jobs, prices, investment, and which industries survive. Subscribe so you don't miss the next update when more details drop and we can see what's real, what's spin, and what it actually means for Canada. Because the stakes here aren't theoretical.